I guess one of the big questions people ask me is, why did you choose music? And it's not a choice. It shows up in your life and you never get rid of it. Born into a musical family in Jamaica, New York, and my grandfather was a musician, was a percussionist. My mother is a singer. And I always remembered music in my life. And I remember my mother says that when I was 3 years old, I was banging on my high chair in rhythm with the radio. That's what she says. My grandfather helped me get started when I was 5 years old. And when I was in first grade, I played in the school band. And I remember he gave me a snare drum that we carried together to school for the Christmas concert. And then we moved to Chicago when I was going into fourth grade. And we moved actually into my grandparents' house. So we had the 6 of us and my parents, moved in with my grandparents and 2 of my aunts, and this huge house in Illinois, in Oak Park, Illinois. And there was drums everywhere and music everywhere. And again, the band rehearsing every Sunday. And I always wanted to be the drummer in the band. And I had lessons starting in Chicago, starting at age 5, with a really hand-picked selection of teachers that eventually led me to my grandfather's teacher, who also taught Louis Belson and a few others, and Gene Krupa, a gentleman named Roy Knapp. And Roy had a percussion school in Chicago. And he also taught us music theory as well as drumming. I stayed with Roy for 4 years. And he went with me to my first gig, and he helped me get through the rehearsals and gave me tips and made it comfortable. And I went on the road when I was in 7th grade. You know, high school, I went to the local Catholic high school. You know those Catholics, they don't raise you up, they force you up. And they taught us. I'm glad I had that education, but I was always in the band. And when I was a sophomore in high school, I went to observe my teacher at the time, Randy, play drums for Guys and Dolls with our high school theater group. And the conductor, Ed Ward, went, "You're playing this year. Randy's not doing the show." And I had never played a Broadway show before. So that was my baptism of fire for Broadway playing. And I actually fell in love with playing Broadway shows because they made it comfortable. They made it easy. I immediately realized how important the drums were to the show. And I also realized the pressure involved with being the one person in the pit that could train wreck the show. And I think I enjoyed it. I started doing gigs around Chicago in high school. I would go to school and leave school and take a nap and go play a gig at night and get home at 3 in the morning and struggle back into high school. This is when I was a junior and senior. Before then, my father actually would come to the gig with me because I started doing that before I could drive. So it was kind of interesting. I was playing drums with my grandfather's band at the time and being closely watched, I think, by my grandfather and guided. He never seemed to be too far away when it came to music. He was always watching what I was doing and checking up on me with his buddies. And eventually I ended up doing some bigger work with him. And I ended up getting placed at DePaul University because that was the next logical step for a private teacher, was a guy named Bob Tillis. And Bobby had the distinction of replacing my grandfather. When my grandfather left CBS in Chicago, Bobby Tillis went to work there and was constantly told to play like my grandfather, like Bobby Christian. Why can't you play like Christian did? And it was a little frustrating to him. My grandfather was known, Bobby Christian was known for covering more than one instrument at a time. He'd be playing timpani and tambourine at the same time, or xylophone and cowbell at the same time, because that's what he did. I had the great experience through most of my adolescent years and into college, going with him during the summer to his recording sessions. So I was in the room when all the old guys recorded the soundtrack for Superfly. And he did work for a guy named Tom Washington and a guy named Curtis Mayfield. And he was their percussionist. And they never wrote parts for him. They just let him go and do his thing. And he came up with parts for the Shy-Lights, the Impressions, all those recording dates. Quincy Jones was a member of my grandfather's band. He played third trumpet in the band. And then when he became a producer, my grandfather worked for Quincy. Then he moved to LA. But my grandfather stayed in Chicago and lived there and passed away when he was 82 years old, but worked right up until the end. And I had already moved out here by that time. I came to Las Vegas in 1976, January 4th. And I was here for a few months and started working out my union card, and then I got some lounge work, and I started wanting to play in main rooms. And I left a situation where I had 2 full-time lounge gigs. I was doubling, and I went home one night and I said, you know, dear, I'm done. I will never play in a lounge again. I want to play in the main rooms, and that's what I'm going to do. And she's like, well, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. And that's when I started going down to the old Union Hall and hanging out. And I remember I wanted to play with one of the Kicks bands that we had. And most of us that are my age and older dearly miss the old Union Hall, because we had the bar that was licensed as a private club. We had a bandstand. It was open for members and their guests only. And every night you'd get off work and go play at the Union Hall. I can remember doing 2 Jubilee shows and then going to play with Herbie Phillips' band till 6 in the morning. And just having a great time sight reading and playing shows. And it was just a great release for us, because what we did in Las Vegas for so many years, and they still do now, is we make music according to someone else's needs and rules. And we do it willingly, we do it openly, we do it happily, but we really want to play. And that's what we did at the Union Hall. There were no rules. And good thing, because we would have abused him anyway. And we had a bar down there, and it was just a blast to go down there and play. One of my earliest experiences in Las Vegas came the month I moved here. Hadn't met the wife yet, still a single guy. I'm 20 years old, and I wander into the Union Hall at about 2 a.m. on a Friday. And there's a band on stage, absolutely roaring. A huge band, 5 trumpets, 4 or 5 trombones, 6 reeds. The rhythm section was just on fire. And the first thing I thought of was, if I'm going to live here, I need to practice. The drummer was my friend Santos Savino. And I'll never forget that night. They scared me into practicing again. And when I finally came back to the Union Hall, I became one of those guys that everybody called. And it was just a great thing. And one night, I was playing Herbie Phillips' band, and it was a Saturday, I think. And the drummer from the Jubilee show walked up to me. And Gordy's exact line was, "Hey kid, you play better than me. I want you to be my sub." And I looked at him, and he said, "I'm Gordy Fry." And he said, "All the guys in my band are playing with you tonight, and they keep telling me how great you sound. And I want a sub that plays good." And he said, 3 or 4 other guys have turned me down because it's a hard show. And of course, being young at the time, like, well, nothing's too hard for me. And I went in there to watch him play the show, and it was a hard show. At the time, Jubilee was 2 hours long. There was almost no break time in it whatsoever. And I watched the show. The book was 92 pages long. And it was amazing to play it. And at the time, it was an 18-piece orchestra. And a lot of those guys aren't around anymore. And it was a great orchestra. And I started subbing for Gordy. And meanwhile, I had been playing at a couple other hotels. I was working for Johnny Haig at Caesars, doing some work for Lou Elias at the DI. And then I ended up on Joe Gershio's band for about 6 years down at the Golden Nugget. And we had a blast. Joe used to introduce us to singers as his below-average white band. And we had a ball. We worked for people I worked for Don Rickles for 6 years. And people like that, and Yakov and these guys. And they all had opening acts, and that's why they needed the orchestra. And then, of course, my favorite story about the main rooms, though, will always be Jack Eglash. When I was working in the lounge at the Sahara, when I first came to town, with a group called the London Bells, Penny and Linda, Jack was the main room band leader and the entertainment director at the hotel. He was a vice president. And I went backstage in the showroom. I met Jack, shook his hand, gave him my business card. Young kid, you know, and I'm like, if you ever need a drummer, please call me. And Jack said, I've heard you play, and I like the way you play, and if I ever need a drummer, I'll call you, but I'm going to keep using the guy that we use for as long as I can. And it was, again, Santos Savino. And it was over 20 years later that Jack called me up, and he said, I need a drummer for the Desert Inn. Santos not available. You want the gig? And I went to work for Jack for a while. It was really bizarre. I was working at Caesars, and I get a call from Lou Elias. And Lou said, you know, I got an act coming in that's going to need a drummer. And my lead trumpet players, Stu Saddlehoff and Walt Blanton, said that I have to call you. Can you make it? And I said, well, yeah, I can make it. I'm not working that week. And so I show up, and it's Petula Clark. Now, I know that era of music. So we start rehearsing, and we finish the first hour, and Petula walked over to me and said, I have a tour coming up. My drummer's ill, can't make it over from England. Can you travel? And I looked at her and I said, I can be on a plane to Los Angeles in about 20 minutes. And she laughed, and I ended up working with her for almost 5 years in the Caribbean, doing ships. Worked with Jack Jones. Worked a long time with a guy named Bob Anderson. And it was a great time. Bob is probably the most talented singing impressionist in the business. He's brilliant. And I got to, well, that's one of the ways that I learned how to work with guys like Jack Jones, because when Bob would do his Jack Jones impression, we would do an impression of Jack's rhythm section. When Bob did his Frank Sinatra bit, we'd try to sound like Frank's section. It was fun. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Top of the Dunes. A lot of the guys in town are. It was a beautiful room on top of the hotel that had great entertainment and colorful maitre d' and all kind of great stuff going on. Buddy Greco and I worked with the music for the show Fever that Buddy wrote for his wife, Leslie. Leslie is a wonderful singer who can carry off the Peggy Lee things. So we wrote a show. Buddy had a relationship in the music business with Peggy Lee that went back to Benny Goodman. When, of course, he used to joke that he and Benny always went round and round because he would tell Benny that the BG on the music stands stood for Buddy Greco. And he and I worked together on and off for the better part of 20 years when I was available. But Buddy liked creativity, especially when we did small group work. And it was a great time being with Buddy. Jack is the most wonderful voice I ever worked for. He's so comfortable with the instrument and so secure about it. He has no musical insecurities. Similar to but not the same as Clint Holmes is now. I worked with Clint Holmes when he was the opening act for Don Rickles. And that was a long time ago. And now when you go to see him, you're looking at someone with no musical boundaries whatsoever, in total command of his instrument. It's amazing to watch guys like that and Jack Jones perform, because you just want to do what they do. Trumpet player Dave Culp was one of the most brilliant lead trumpet players that ever lived in Las Vegas. Dave and I worked for Johnny Hague at Caesars at pretty much the same time. You know, and because of Johnny Hague, I played with people like Chuck Berry, you know, some Frida Payne, another one. I did a show with Sid Caesar, Danny Thomas, and Milton Berle, the living legends of comedy. And my grandfather said, when you see Danny Thomas, walk up to him and say, Bobby Christian says hello. So I walked up to Danny Thomas. Bobby Christian says hello. And Danny's eyes got big and he said, how do you know him? So he's my grandfather. He said, your grandfather was the first drummer I ever wrote a paycheck to. And it happened to me again with Blackstone Jr. I used to do small tours with Harry. And I was leaving one night with a case I had. And one of my drum cases said Bobby, still had the Bobby Christian stencil on it. And it still does now even. And Harry saw it and he said, where'd you get that? So that's my grandfather. He said, your grandfather was my father's drummer. So it's kind of an interesting business that way, you know, for people like us. I think the best day I've ever had was when Herbie Phillips used to record the band. He'd make cassettes of the band, really crude. He'd put a cassette player in his trumpet case and put a towel over it and turn it on. And he would give each one of the members of the rhythm section a copy and each lead player a copy. And I would send my grandfather a copy. So I sent him a copy and he called me up and he said, I got that tape you sent me. Great band, what a marvelous writer. Who's that great drummer? I said, me. And from that day until he passed away 10 years later, we were suddenly colleagues. Because, you know, when I was younger, we had this relationship where he'd give me advice and he'd look at me and he'd say, that's a $100 lesson. But all of a sudden, when I'm out here and he was back in Chicago, he hears me play on a tape and we were colleagues, which made all the difference for me. Future, I don't know. I'll retire to give myself more time to be creative. You know, I've got some music that I need to get played, and I have to find the right guys to play it. I did a very creative album with a gentleman named Walter Blanton, trumpet player, Tony Bronco on piano, that was all spontaneously composed, and I would like to resurrect that and see it do something. I may just enter a me era, where I'm going to take care of my needs creatively for a while. You know, we play for other people all of our lives. And it's okay, it's good. It's a great feeling to make someone comfortable. But after a while, you want to do your thing. And I think I'm tired of waiting for that, I think. To those of you coming up kind of through the ranks in any city of the United States, you need to join the AF&M. Because of the AF&M, many of us have had health insurance. Many of us have pensions. Many of us have been aided by the union in getting paid properly. We only got a raise because it was negotiated. These are people, hopefully, in your town that are working for your best interest. But I also need to tell you that you need to attend the meetings. They are hired to act in your best interest. So don't allow them to think they know your best interest. Go to the meeting and tell them what your best interest is. But it's a very important organization. There are people in Los Angeles and Chicago, New York, because of their work experience, that are now making more money retired than they made when they were working because of the pension, They're there to help. They know everything about the contracts. They know everything about the insurance. They know everything about the pension. How do you guys that aren't making a living make a better living plan? Say no if it's not enough money. That's what we used to do. So basic advice to you youngsters is say no to small money and yes to the union, and you'll be much better off. Just remember, a union is only as strong as its weakest member. It's not up to the officers, it's up to the members. So be smart, learn the contract, but join the union.